Львівський муніципальний мистецький центр.
Very nice to be here. My name is Saskia van Штайн. I'm the director of the International Architecture Biennale of Rotterdam. We are a foundation. Please, if you feel for being closer, there's a spot here. I won't do anything. It's a bit nicer, otherwise you're so far away. So I run a foundation that is 21 years old and that deals with design by research on a larger scale. And I'm here together with Gerjan Streng, who is the founder of Bright. He will speak after me. I'll speak about 30 minutes and I will share a little bit of the work of the Biennale. I will share something about Panorama Ukraine, the reason that we are here, and I will share maybe 10 slides on what I see as the trends in the Dutch design field at the moment. So maybe just some sort of like inspiration, or let's hope so. Then Gerjan will present his work, and then we have maybe some space for questions. And if I use too difficult words or if I am speaking too fast, you just feel free. I can say things differently. Yeah? Don't be shy. I know that's... Okay, so who am I? I moderate debates. I like talking. I like talking and thinking with other people. It is a way for me to become a sharper... my guilty pleasure is that I'm working on a PhD on Disney. And I think we need better storytelling. I can consider myself as a storyteller. I make exhibitions. I'm a cultural figure. And over the last 25 years, I have shifted from being a real cultural figure to more practice-orientated. We'll see that in a second. And for me, Disney and identity and storytelling are ways of inspiring. And I'd love to give a lecture, but then I have to come back because it's another 3 hours. I'm also teacher at the Design Academy in Eindhoven, the Design Academy that you might know. But I'm here, as now mentioned already, director of IABR. We are a knowledge and network foundation, one could say. So we really aim to connect design by research to a public audience, education and debate. It looks a bit overwhelming, that's why I look so tired. But our core business is this. We make biennales where we really emphasize, this is not going, somehow there's a bug. Okay, so the biennale actually focuses on a topic, and with this topic we organize large exhibitions that ideally are hopeful for the profession, but also, let's say, look at the spatial implications of our large challenges for our cities, for our landscapes. So we translate the larger challenges. I will get to that in a second, because these are, as far as I'm concerned, the larger challenges that we are facing. And I know that I'm saying this in a context where you have also many other challenges, but the biodiversity loss is something that I'm very concerned with. Because of course that talks about back towards our food production, but also that the planet is getting hotter. I've been told that in Ukraine there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to climate. But if you don't believe in the climate, then you must understand that we are maybe in a system in decline. This system in decline talks about how large world building, what is a system? We are the system. But we see a shift at the moment, and depending a bit on where you stand, if you are traditional or conservative or progressive, you are somewhere here. And yesterday, somebody, actually the director of this institute, told me we are in the eye of the storm at the moment, where there is this strange situation that the whole world seems to be in turmoil, but we are still living our lives. So how is that to be understood? An awareness to maybe bring to the conversation is that I'm very deeply concerned about the financialization of our profession, at least in the Dutch context. I'm thinking this is also globally the fact. where you see that the amount of global capital and the skyline is equally related. So our practice has become maybe hijacked a little bit by finance. And my talk today will look at ways that we can talk about value and not so much about finance. So we even call it Excel sheet architecture in Holland at the moment. We can talk about that later in a moment. This hints at the fact that property and speculation actually cynically mean that often our architecture makes more money than we do. Well, that's maybe not the way to go. This coincides with the moment where we have to acknowledge that our practice is also part of maybe an extractive way of dealing with things that is slightly problematic. So what you see here, let me just try to sleep. You see actually the amount of CO2 produced in the last 150 years roughly. And then the entanglement where our profession actually is related to: economy, policy, resource, land, infrastructure, knowledge, culture, and labor. And how can we move beyond understanding architecture? And when I say architecture, I mean urbanism and landscape, of course, that is not extractive but giving, because the idea that we withdraw material. Just to give you one anecdote, I once spoke to Frank Gehry, and it was absolutely not a problem that the facade of the Bilbao Guggenheim, I'm sure you know this very elegant building, titanium, and he was saying that each sheet of the facade went around the globe 3 times. This is the kind of rhetoric I think we need to question. It's not that I'm for a sort of locality, because I do think we are all cosmopolitan people, but that we at least understand where our materials come from. This hints at the right to nature, a movement that is actually growing, and it speaks about how we need to protect maybe the planet from ourselves. I'll leave it at that, we can talk. And this coincides with a moment of a reappreciation of different kind of knowledges. So maybe some knowledges we have to look back in order to look forward. So the idea to, maybe your mother has a good idea to deal with old skills or something that we lost along the way in order to move forward. Well, this is just setting the horizon for my talk. It will get hopeful from here, I promise. I will share a little bit about my first Biennale. It's about time. And anybody know this image? It's a fairly well-known image about, it's called the Blue Marble. And it is the first whole image that was taken from the earth. It was the moment of awakening, early 70s. And when I say we, I speak from a Western perspective, from the Netherlands, so maybe you're not my we, but I hope that we can find that conversation. But this actually, for instance, initiated NGOs like Greenpeace. This was really a very important moment in the 70s. It was actually a collage, but it was made on the Apollo 17 mission in '72. And what I find very interesting actually is that you see a very fragile ecosystem. You see the whole planet. And this awareness, plus how we look at things, is very inspiring, because this is the way the image was taken. It's maybe hard to distinguish up and down in space, but they turned the image around for, again, the Western gaze to recognize Africa. Why am I sharing this? Is that I think we are at the moment also, please feel free, there's a spot here. Okay, you'd rather sit there, fantastic. So it's maybe the end of the world, that's at least how we could think about it, but to me, we're living in a period where it's the end of a world, and we have to look for I always struggle with this word, multiplicity. Let me say it differently. So It's About Time actually tries to understand how architecture can respond to change. Change in a moment of polycrisis, where we are somehow stuck with all these different outcomes of our day and age. And I believe that architecture has the quality to redefine what we consider space, both material and immaterial. I'll get to that in a second. But this is, to me, the new way to think about things. And personally, I think we need to start rebuilding all of this from the ground up. I'm sure you know the UN Sustainable Goals, but they are organized in many ways. This is my favorite one. But the first exhibition I made, and I'll go very fast, but Limits to Growth is a publication that was made in collaboration with MIT. It was the industrial leaders that understood that the way we are organizing life can in fact not continue. So they asked the scientists, and they used computation already then to make 11 strategies for a future around these criteria. So what you see here is actually coinciding with this perfect storm that I was talking about: food, natural resources, pollution. Back then we used to talk about the hole in the ozone layer, or what was it, acid rain. Language also changes, right? We have our own pollutions at the moment, of course air. Population growth and output per capita. Well, they made a napkin drawing, tried to understand the world as a whole, and from that they started to design. And what I'll only have, we had, well, you were in it with your office also, but we had, I think, 120 objects, if not more. But what I wanted to introduce here is already on the White House, they had solar panels in the 70s. And then, of course, someone else got in charge, and they removed it, and they introduced the idea of green growth. So how maybe an economy based on fossil fuel could happily somehow work together with notions of extraction. So I said already, I am an exhibition maker. I like to think about the symbolic gesture of the spaces that we exhibit in. And one moment under the shower, I thought, I cycle past this beautiful ruin of a gas holder. Let me see if I can get the key. Well, I will not bother you, but it was very difficult. But we managed to kiss this beauty to life. It hadn't been open for 20 years. And we opened it with our exhibition. The exhibition has the backbone of 50 years of popular culture, architecture experimentation, policy making in dealing with, let's say, a changing environment. And what we decided to do is actually look at time as a very important component to design with. So we had the accelerator, which is a Dutch model. We like technocratic solutions. We like to speed up. So we had 2050 Plus. It's a Milano, Italy-based office that looked at synthetic futures to question a little bit, how will we feed the planet? I can't go into each project, but I'm just giving you a little bit of a amuse-de-bouche, as they say in France. The architect as an activist, often very short-term, often with bottom-up, community-driven. This is a beautiful project. The office is called Encore Heureux, which means I'm still happy, which I think a very funny name for architecture office. But outside you see drawings that have a negative impact. So they worked with communities to ask, what are your biggest fears? And then inside they asked them, what do you see as solutions? And even though it is just maybe a beginning of a conversation, it is a touching piece. And the last one is the ancestor. So how can we look back, as I already mentioned, to look forward? So which kind of material? Here you see a rammed earth pavilion by Una Pama Kundu, a both Berlin and Delhi, India-based architect. And we worked with students actually to make the pavilion. And you can't really see here, but in the spiral, in the beginning, you can see that they're still learning, and by the end, it really looks perfect. And of course, we had the ancestor pavilion outside for birds and others, always working with conversation, theater, in this case VR, and in the transition arena, we had a lot of, as I said, maybe people could sticker where they are. Where do you feel we are at the moment? Well, I know a manifesto is maybe a bit outdated, but for It's About Time we worked on a manifesto that maybe could also work in our day and age. So act upon the climate problem as a short term, but also connected to deep time. So how do you, in your offices, organize around time, capacity building, think radical but act pragmatic. So you, let's say, can find this also on our website. We make a beautiful exhibition. Okay, I need to speed up already, sorry. I have 150 slides, so I hope you're doing okay. Second project that I wanted to share, I'm sure you think that everything is going fantastic in Holland, but to be honest, we are living in a period where there's quite some fragmentation in our field, and there are not so many people that are trying to unify what architecture means. So I've lived and worked in Maastricht, which is in the south of the Netherlands, for a bit, and I returned to Rotterdam, where I currently reside, and I felt, and I looked around and saw a whole fragmented field. So I thought, let's make, no political ambition to organize the future of our country. So I thought, okay, let's make our own ministry. So this means the Ministry of Making. And the Ministry of Making looks at, I always have to, all the different challenges we have in the Netherlands. So if there is no policy that is made by the government, maybe we should help them. So this was our attempt. This is our then Minister of Housing. And the idea is that we are a population of 17.8 million people, and we need 1 million houses. So it's quite tempting. I can go into the reason why, but let's say the market was given a lot of freedom in the Netherlands. That's the summary of it. And I showed you this polycrisis map already, and what we see is that this was our then government. They are all having a piece of the puzzle. So you see this silo thinking is part of the challenge. So our king is asking, how will all of this connect in an integral manner? We faked a press conference with the minister talking about soil quality, sea level rise, the nitrogen crisis, energy transition, which Gerjan will speak about. So how can we, using the quality of our Dutch designers, and this was a project just after COVID, we just thought we make a very large test kit. And this test kit had 10,000 houses, 5,000 trees, and a site that everyone could choose for themselves. And they would make a design in 2 months. Was it 2 months? Well, very short. Well, you get it. It was people could choose, and then there was an online environment where they could substantiate. But we had 101 good ideas for the Netherlands, and it was the biggest exhibition I've ever worked on. For those of you that are not so good in typography, this is Holland, and we really situated all the boxes in where they are. So that led to an enormous wealth of design propositions. We didn't get the minister in, but very high into the government. We had officials coming, we did workshops, and it was really amazing to do it with nearly no money. I know all of this looks very, I literally myself made the shape of the Netherlands. It's not to feel, good thing is that after COVID we could have large party. If you have 101 offices, you have more than 1,000 people, so it really felt like a Berlin underground party. Last project before I go to Panorama is Nature of Hope. We just finalized this one. Maybe to share a little bit how I get my ideas. In the Netherlands, we have two larger problems. One, the CO2, and one is the nitrogen, because besides the architectural imprint, of course, we are the biggest or the second biggest producer of food. So this nitrogen map was made by our government, and just before summer break, they put it into the public realm without, let me calling it, doing the massage, because it was about farmers that needed to sell their land because they were having too much imprint with their production. It's like giving a party in your house and then finishing your fridge. It's not how it works. So this actually coincided with the moment where the right-wing party, who has been growing already since 2008, really gained a lot of votes just with this rhetoric of fear. So these two things led me to question, how can we, Nature of Hope, think through the landscape in a hopeful manner? And how can we use hope as a let's say, engine to change the rhetoric, instead of only have fear, 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 and people become, well, fearful. So I thought young people, the curators I worked with, and the main premise was, how can we connect humankind to a larger understanding of ecology? And this is just a collage. And here you recognize the diagram I just showed. But we had 90 projects that somehow dealt with the larger challenges of our profession. We had many conversations, for instance, on women in architecture, bio-based solutions in architecture, financial models in architecture. This is a beautiful model by Lola, crop art. Lola Landscapes worked to see how we could, maybe with smaller parcels, redesign the Netherlands. This is a speculative work that looks at, can microbial life and crystals repair concrete? Because in the Netherlands we are addicted to demolish and rebuild as soon as we say that a building is no longer to be restored. But that means, of course, that someone makes a lot of money by this transition, and the rents go up at least by 30%. We also did, what was it? 28 projects outside. I can't really, I won't get into it, but just so you know what my world is a little bit. And the main proposition is actually that we have some very large transitions to embrace. And these transitions, it's maybe not to think about climate because it's fairly negative, but start to relate to nature a bit more in our ecologies. Which kind of transformations can we embrace? We see that this kind of conversation was on the periphery, but it's becoming mainstream, from the individual to the collective, and that can only be done in a collaborative effort between market and public sector. All these questions are large and systemic, but one last project that I will share has to do with people in the neighborhood of Bospolder-Tussendijken, which is adjacent to where we are. You are looking at the harbor of Rotterdam, and we are here, and this is Bospolder-Tussendijken. 174 different nationalities are living here, and already my predecessor started analyzing what does it mean, the energy transition. So these are all houses that are on gas, and they're shifting to hydrogen networks. Zeg ik het goed? Nee.
District heating.
District heating, thank you. And what we looked at, in this case, OOS, was a local energy action plan. So how can the individual connect to this larger systemic question? And maybe a one-size-fits-all is not the way forward. So they looked at what can we do on a very small footprint, and look at, for instance, collective heating strategies, that people could own their own decentralized model. And that goes with a lot of community building, a lot of conversations, a lot of participation. And one of our partners is actually, it's called House of the Future. And usually people like myself come in and we're then the curator, but here I just looked at people that are already doing great work and we empower them. And one of the things is just very simple, that we organize this heated, one heated room in a block, and people can just come there, have conversations. There's a workshop, in this case by Studio Care, where we looked at, this is a nomadic Moroccan tradition, where the nomadic people actually share one blanket, so they heat each other. Very simple. And if you want a coffee here, you first have to grind it yourself. So you cycle and you make your own coffee in that way. It is provocative, of course, but it does talk about maybe civic active position. How to get in contact with people that are others. I said already 174 different nationalities. And we noticed that the Moroccan women like to bake their own bread. So what you see here is a wooden oven in a mobile unit that is situated 3 times a week on a different spot in the neighborhood. So they come with their dough and they bake the bread, and while they are there we can talk about energy. It sounds a bit maybe an enormous, is it still architecture? Yes. Can we call it social design? Maybe. But it is at least in a very small steps activating the community, giving them back citizenship. And we've noticed that bread and food and music sometimes are entry points. Funnily enough, it's easier to get in contact with the woman than with the men. I'll leave that out there for further conversation. So here and now, urban dialogues. Maybe some of you saw the lecture of Mr. Floris Alkemade. He was our state architect, and he donated to our foundation 25,000 euros to think about the rebuilding of Ukraine. And that actually led to me thinking, okay, we have this money, but how can we scale up and how can we connect to different communities that are doing similar work, maybe in different scales, either through time. That led to Panorama Ukraine. And I'm standing here, but it's a huge group that I will introduce to you now. So how do we relate? This is the size of the Netherlands projected into the size of, so you see we're super small. Maybe how we can relate is that this whole project is really about collaborative effort, but it is deeply rooted in the Dutch history to think through design, because our country is under sea level, in some spots even 7 meters. So that is a huge rationalization of this land, the land that you may know through our paintings. And I like this picture because it actually shows this rationalization in the top. If you fly over Holland, it's all compartmentalized. That's of course not how nature was made. Through this awareness of that we have to deal with the water, I think we are already thinking through different levels of governance, of working together. And this, let's say, our biggest challenge now is to deal with this water, the sea level rise. And the other thing is that we maybe need a bit more of a porosity in our design attitudes. And an inspiring example is this space for the river, where you see that actually it's not so much a straight, because a river does not want to be straight, like a woman doesn't want to be in a corset, or a man either, but you see here that we make space for the river, and that actually of course asks for a different way of understanding to live with the water and not be defensive towards it. Well, it always helps to have play. This actually goes underwater, so you can't always play. Panorama Ukraine was of course inspired by Panorama Scheveningen, which is a coastal town in the center of the Netherlands, a 360 degrees understanding of our world. And that inspired Panorama Netherlands, where the Floris Alkemade that I already mentioned was one of the initiators. So it is our aim to actually have the same kind of desirable futures for Ukraine ready, again with a lot of partners. And these desirable perspectives on redevelopment actually have a double entendre. So on the one hand, it is of course related to the full-scale invasion and the restoration as such, but maybe also sharing and looking at the agenda we have together. As I mentioned, CO2, nitrogen, energy, water, maybe even the togetherness in our society. We have to redesign all of that. So maybe it gives you shelter to know that you have Ukrainian friends in the Netherlands. This is the UN network, the Ukraine-Netherlands Urban Network, and they organize many different knowledge sessions for children, for well, they're immensely active. Some were already in the Netherlands. And this is how our meetings look. So there's always a lot of team building going back and forth, so a lot of screen time together. And we sort of allocated these as the major spatial themes that we are sharing together. I don't know, I think it's this thematic approach is what we decided on. And through the thematic approach, we target these topics that we organize lectures about, workshops. And maybe the large thing that I'm constantly getting at is how can we connect real spatial problems to system thinking, that we hopefully maybe can have a smart transition in the way we develop our projects. Then there's table leaders, and table leaders, they design a brief, and that actually makes for, let's say, the content and the question of the particular workshop. So our first one was related to the bombing of the Kakhovka Dam. So this militarization of infrastructure is, of course, something, well, we in the practice think maybe have to have an extra antenna by now, the way the geopolitical things are shifting. But that results in table leaders sitting down, and this was really an amazing project. Some went for very localized solutions, other for very systemic solutions. So what you see that besides the water, as I said already, maybe this was also the time to question, do we need the dam, and what do we need the dam for? The dam did much more than only protect against the water, it also brought energy. But how to think through an agricultural system, maybe use water differently. And I'm sure you know that we have both 2 hot summers. I heard somebody shared that last summer here it was for weeks, what was it, 35 degrees, or like really hot, so we need to contain the water. And then again, different temporalities of thinking through the water, absorbing it, maybe it can take some space, leading into this kind of very large system. So the method is that we're constantly learning by designing research. The workshop is our vehicle. We co-create knowledge. We try to not be imperialistic, but bring everybody's knowledge to the table. We work with different stakeholders. You mentioned yesterday already, for instance, and I'm sure you'll dwell on that, that in the energy workshop, you connected to energy specialists. So this sounds the most straightforward thing, but we usually do not do this. So how can these worlds of expertise find each other? The second one that we worked on was neighborhoods, and always we work with local partners. So we take questions, real questions from real either cities or oblast into consideration. So here it was the energy, and these are all sister cities of Dutch cities. So just so we go back and forth. So the what we are hoping to provide is a network of people and a network of ideas that we could hopefully bring forward once the war ends. Let's say, I mean, it's again a panorama. What we also do is always one in Netherlands and one in Ukraine, so we alternate. And this is sort of the outcome of many of the workshops. We're working on a website at the moment where everything is also shared, and the dream would be that also other contexts can learn from this way of thinking. So, okay, I have to speed up a little bit. I will not say anything about energy because that is your domain. But we also do very small things, like Oleg, you and I met and we had a dinner, and I said, how can I be very hands-on? And you said, we need books because our academy just shifted. And this was just the beginning, but we just did an open call, and then the books were brought here. We hope to actually keep on doing this. And as I said, we don't do this alone. I'm standing here on behalf of all these people. Finalizing my talk, some, let's say, hints of where things are going in the Netherlands. And I think the question of centralization and decentralization on many levels is a big question, and distribution and redistribution. We are shifting from an agricultural and maybe harbor economy to a distribution economy. I can get the, but the major thing is that we are connecting not so much the horizon. We used to think through horizon, but we are connecting to a verticality. So how does our architecture land in a particular context? I'm sure you know the very famous Rem Koolhaas, OMA, who said, fuck the context. That's no longer the case. We embrace the context and introduce verticality. In this case, for instance, a project in the harbor, the Urbanisten, a landscape architect, and I'm very consciously not starting with architecture, but landscape, because we see that that is really one of the powering tools of our urban fabric at the moment. And what they did is actually design everything we do not see. So they designed the under the maaiveld, well, under, again, what you can't see, in order to pull in, again, this is the harbor, and the harbor, in our case, is has an open relationship to the sea. So the water is a tidal water, 1.5 meters up and down. So that results in, it doesn't look maybe sexy on this image, but I took it in the winter, it just opened. It's amazing to see how many birds, and Holland is really a bird hub, fishes, trees, it's really more verticality. In this case, for instance, an old infrastructure, the Hofbogen, where you see that the connectivity between deeper water systems is brought back. This is a park of 2.5 kilometers. You might know the High Line. We have our own High Line. And we are currently testing, but it's not designed for humans. It's designed for 3 major species, butterflies, bees, and, oh, I forgot that. The one they roll up and they have all the hedgehogs. Thank you for helping me. Okay, some trends. We see that designers are designing the tools in a very complex layer and mannering. So this is an older project, but still one of my darlings. It's called the Keuvel. And the idea was that it was a toxic land. And what they proposed is to have nature take over and purify the land. Secondly, they added all this, let's say, houseboats. Yeah, but I was retired houseboats. And then, of course, in order for themselves also not to touch it, they have this pattern that connects everything. And now, well, it has also become a total hub in the north. You feel already that it is extremely successful. I would say that what we are also embracing is the idea of seeing this. I already said we try to see the city as a vertical, so connecting to the ground, but also using surfaces on top of buildings. So this is Duck Park by Zus, and this is IKEA. Actually, on the IKEA, there's a football field which they wanted to expand. There was a football field next to it, and they just put it on top. Very Dutch designish. Not so Dutch designish is maybe small pavilions of rammed earth. We really see that this localization, bio-based, more milieu thinking, so natural ventilations, maybe a humble architecture, not so much this grand gesture that we're known for, really related intrinsically in the landscape. So this is, it looks like a building, but it is actually an ecological boost. It's an insect hotel, it has solar panels, well, you get the thing, but also not every local material is, in our case, for instance, the brick is our local material. So here you see a building that has just been finalized, a different kind of ornamentation also, Happel Cornelissen Verhoef, Rotterdam-based. This ornamentation I'm very interested in. You see here, this is how we used to build our farms, but you see that there's little play in how the ornamentation works. A retrofitting of industrial and utilitarian building. This is Nimeto. It is an old school. Our schools, usually after 30, 40 years, we demolish them. And we are really, there's a group of people that are passionate, Mevrouw Meijer, Miss Meijer, in looking how we can use the finance differently and use it and refurbish. Because, of course, our architecture are also containers of not only memory, but also CO2. So why demolish if you can actually retrofit? Well, as said, refurbishment, reappreciation of heritage. I have to go faster because I'm over my 40 minutes. Well, I think it speaks for this. This is one of the first was by Civic, together with many others, Inside Out, Meccano. But what they did was this old train factory, let me call it that. Yeah, repair shop, thanks. And they totally retrofitted it into a library, there's a restaurant, there's a theater, a multi-complex, and still honoring, let's say, the history of this place. It looks amazing. Maybe a new way of dealing with skill and de-skilling. This is our Dutch parliament, and this was retrofitted all with fabric, and the architect says the coat was there, I only repaired the interior of the coat. So again, enclosing these spaces, our Dutch bank, well, I mean, it's very symbolic that the Dutch bank did not build a new bank but retrofitted it. We see color, and ornamentation, which is very un-Dutch. There's just one prize, Monadnock, in Hilversum. It's social housing. It's a big breakthrough. We haven't been looking at social housing for a long time. New technologies, well, they're not so new. I know that you did a marvelous top-up, Anton, here on a hospital, but how do we deal with the potential of cross-laminated timber or CNC? I think a whole new aesthetic will arise. What we see is actually the architect also becoming a developer and a builder. This is Powerhouse Company. So of course, we, in the Dutch context, have lost a lot of grip on the larger frame and process, and a lot of money goes towards managers. So how can we somehow gain that grip back? In this case, Powerhouse Company does everything. So the developer, the architect, and the builder. They're a red company. Still this very Dutch sort of, we call it the klare lijn, something very, this is an industrial building for bicycles actually in Amsterdam. Already said, this technocratic solution, will it bring something or not? Cooperative dwelling, people coming together with an architect, in this case 30 friends, rebuilt. And a very interesting thing is that they could not get their mortgage financed in the Netherlands. So they had to go to Germany in order to get the money, in order to work together in their dwelling. And I've been told, I'm not 100% sure, that the facade, a large part of the facade, people took just scrap wood from the street and started to work with that. So you see this follow forms waste. Again, a modest architecture maybe, but it is a whole facade. This is for bats, there's sedum that connects, and there you see all the different specificities of how the architecture tries to become a boost for ecology and bio-based. This one I already showed. Can we manifest, this is a non-Dutch, but I'm so inspired. It's maybe not the most beautiful architecture, but these people really built their own habitat in Uruguay. It's amazing. I think we need new storytelling, new speculative ideas, new experimentation. We have to maybe repair our notions of pedagogy, because the sole architecture signature is shifting a little bit. And two projects that I'll finish off with is that we see that architects are doing systemic research. In this case, Platform Woonopgave. It is led by two people that look at this question I shared. We need 1 million houses in the Netherlands. But they say, don't look at 1 million houses, look at 1 million spaces where people can live, which is a whole different mindset. Because then why is a factory not transitioned into maybe student housing? Then of course we have to think through how does that work. And what we see is that we're still building for families, and in the Dutch context the family is only 24% of the people we build for. But the way we build, we have to be more nuanced to look at, maybe change the legislation in order to enable differentiation. Here you see the top-up that I was already referring to. Last slide. Something that I'm very inspired by is an initiative by Berlin-based a group of architects, B+. They it actually came from a student project, but that's beside the point. Look it up, demolition drama. It is showing how our practice is maybe hijacked by this idea of renovation and demolished by rebuild. And we are currently with, and I hope, well, we're currently hoping to change European legislation that you have to show why you need to demolish a building in order to build a new building. And that's not, again, to be nostalgic, but there are so many great examples of buildings that actually can come to life again if they're technically still solid. So I would finalize here. I thank you for attention. I hope it was not too much, but the future is collaborative, and I'm very happy. I see some of our partners here. Thank you for the beautiful collaboration, because sometimes we have to have the individual thinking, but it only works if we truly, properly collaborate. So thank you for your attention, and open to questions later on. The floor is now up to Gerjan Streng.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Saskia, for the lecture. It's always challenging to follow up on that, but I'll try my best. It's also nice to be here and see the results of the Panorama Ukraine that we worked on. Like, I was part of the workshop on sustainable energy. And what I realized during the workshop that we did is that in collaborating as designers with people with an energy background is that we speak different languages, of course, Dutch and Ukrainian, but also the way we use words and the way we think of how these systems work is entirely different. And we had the opportunity to bring that together. And what we also realized is that we're working on the short term, but we're also building infrastructure for the long term, right? Every infrastructure investment, especially in the energy system, you do now, and it needs to be paid off in the next 60 to 100 years. So even in repairing the systems, in making sure that it's maintained, that it's still functioning, every investment there is still an investment for the next decades. So what I would like to do today is share with you some methods of using scenario planning and incorporating this long-term thinking in our designs as urban planners, maybe as architects, but also as energy planners. A little bit about me. I'm Gerjan Streng. I was trained as an architect. I have an office that I co-founded in Amsterdam. And we say we're a research and development company for our spatial environment, which is a bit pretentious, but we like to just figure out things and play around. We're an office of 8 now, so still quite modest. And we tend to not do client-based work that much, or client-initiated. Usually we try to figure out lines of thinking that we're interested in, the role of energy in our environment, nature-inclusive building, how we deal with circularity, and then we just pick projects that we like and kind of share our observations as a way of kind of keeping a much longer term of thinking open. So what I always like is these diagrams by Danny and Rape, speculative designers, in thinking of, well, we're now here, and we know that at some point we're going to be here. This is the future. This is where we'd like to be. Like, this is the preferential future, but there's many other futures, right? There's a probability, there's a plausibility, and then there's also a possible future. And somehow, as designers, we're kind of trying to narrow and kind of navigate this process of going there in the future. Another one which is more, let's say, pedagogically maybe supported is by my colleagues of the Future Urban Region, just the research group of the Academies of Architecture in Amsterdam, to also show to clients or to collaborators how this process works, right? So if you're in a design process, it's always a matter of kind of widening up and then narrowing it down. So every time you make a sketch or a drawing, you kind of, you freeze your thinking a little bit, then you have a conversation, you have a dialogue, new input, and kind of opens it up. So how do we kind of go through this process and weave our way in design thinking into a future? Now, I'm not a prophet. Don't have kind of a clairvoyant of what the future is, but there are trends that we see, that we detect in our work. So thinking in scenarios is a way of kind of opening that conversation, but also to make sure that it's a clear conversation, right? We're not just dreaming about a future, but we're trying to get there and we're trying to design on that. I need to show a little bit about this background of scenarios, and then we need to go back to the Cold War. Herman Kahn was a military strategist from the US. He worked for the RAND company, which is kind of a weird secretive part of the Pentagon. What he did was thinking in the time of the US and the Soviets, how would a nuclear war play out? So if one action comes, what would be the response? What would then be the action? What would be the response? So it's very linear, right? Action, reaction, action, reaction. But what he wrote is, well, in doing this, you can already think about the consequences without it actually happening, right? You go through the scenario as a way to prepare. Like, how would we respond? How would someone else respond to that? And that thinking has been incorporated in the much more corporate world. So Pierre Schwartz, together with Pierre Wacky, were thinkers, designers at Shell in the 70s. And what they were doing for this fossil-based petrol company, British, Dutch, before now British, is what is going on in the world? What might happen, because we're doing these billions of dollars of investments in doing explorations in different parts of the world. And if some world-changing event happens, we lose billions. So can we think of all different futures that we can imagine and then see if an investment is possible or if it's also still feasible in all of these scenarios? Now I'm showing two of our projects. One is more of a qualitative approach, so storytelling. The other one is more data-driven, so more quantitative. And Saskia already showed some beautiful images of how the Netherlands came into being. I need to show a little bit about the energy history of the Netherlands, because I think you're all aware that the Dutch made the Netherlands and water and yada, yada, yada. But many places in the Netherlands actually are energy landscapes. So maybe you recognize this, the peatlands were dug up and dried and basically just burned for energy. Like peat is the pre-phase of coal. Just if you wait long enough, this would turn into coal. But many parts of the Netherlands were completely cleared of this material, right? You realize we're already living under sea level, and then we have this bit of soil and we take it away. But these landscapes are now highly valued as recreational landscapes. So you see the kind of the stripes of the landscape that Saskia showed. This is where the peat was taken out, and they left little parts because otherwise it would become sea in the wind. So it's a very methodological landscape that is now unrecognizable. Another part, of course, with the windmills. This is the Zaandam, so it's the area north of Amsterdam. It's highly industrial, hundreds, thousands of windmills to do timber cutting, grinding, but also pumping the water out. So all these processes were wind powered, and now it's a tourist site, tourist attraction. I needed that little background to also show what is going on in the Veluwe. Veluwe is the largest national park in the Netherlands. It's in the center of the country. And there's a little village called Eerbeek, 5,000 inhabitants. 100,000 people stay there every year as tourists. They stay in this area because it's beautiful nature, it's quiet. There's some relics of old streams. And if you start to follow these streams, you come across these kind of structures. I don't know how to translate sprengkop, but it's basically the source of a stream, but it's man-made. So there is no water power in the Netherlands, but if you dig deep enough, you will find water. And because of the topology of this landscape, there is enough of a height difference that you can kind of dig up the water and build waterfalls. Like we actually have this the highest waterfall in the Netherlands. Of course, man-made. There's beautiful estates with these ponds, and these ponds were used to store water. So you take a little bit of water out of the soil, build all these canals, and then collect the water to, at some point, make sure that you can turn a water mill. So there's no water power, but if you just engineer this whole landscape, there is just enough to make the wheel go round. So Eerbeek now is national park, valued for its ecology and landscape, but it's actually an industrial landscape if you go back centuries ago. So this whole landscape of wind turbine or water turbine after water turbine that was initially used for oil grinding, beech nuts grinding. Later on it was used to produce paper. So the forest that is now a natural park was planted there to grow the trees to make the paper. The fibers of the process were kind of drained out in the land, which would fertilize the land for agriculture. And if you kind of look at it at a system level, it made sense. Locally, you produce your energy, you have water, you have a production facility for paper, you grow the forest to grow the paper, and the paper was used in monasteries in towns nearby. Now we skip forward 4 centuries. So today, these paper factories are still there. But instead of water power, they now use natural gas that comes from Groningen, Russia for a while. Now it's probably liquefied natural gas from Dubai or the US. The paper comes from Finland, or the wood comes from Finland, and the paper goes all around the world. And it looks like this. So it's an industrial site in the middle of the national park. And what you already see here is that people live right next to these factories. So this is the view from someone's backyard, and there's a paper factory just producing paper. And for 4 centuries, this went quite okay, right? The village existed because of the paper industry, so people moved there to work. The paper factories got bigger, so people moved to the town. And everybody there either worked in the factory or knew someone that worked there or worked in related industries. There's a lot of packaging companies, graphic designers. So there's a whole industry there. And it was okay, but regulations in the Netherlands changed, especially for smell, for nuisance of smells and sound. And all of a sudden, this situation could not exist anymore within the regulation. So everything in the town came to a halt. The factories could not grow anymore. They could produce, but they could not extend. They could not grow anymore. But also the plans for new housing were stopped. The city municipality was working on 2 new schools that would replace old ones, that would become new housing. Not possible anymore within the regulation. So if you go back, you understand the system of the stream with all the wind turbines to a situation which is a bit pixely, but where you have 3 factories producing for the world market that has come much more separated from their surroundings. And the situation was in a deadlock. So politicians were not talking to the industry anymore. The industries were not talking to the residents anymore. They're all fighting this huge legal case or legal cases. And what we tried to do is not come up with a instant solution, but try to look for, well, what would be the long-term perspective, right? What is this desirable future? Can we talk about that? And I also have to say, this is a project that we started. We basically adopted the town of Eerbeek. I've never heard of it before I went there 10 years ago, and I was kind of the first picture that I showed of the factory next to a house was my first picture of Eerbeek that I saw. So it's also a kind of a fascination for me, this town. How does this exist? And if you start digging, if you start looking for information, you start to understand that. And I think that's the case in many places, right? You need to go back and trace this history a little bit to understand which decisions were made and how it led to the current situation. And then it all makes sense, usually. So we try to go through that process and look for leads in the past that would still be valuable in 2050 or 2100. And combine that with what are the core uncertainties for Eerbeek. So that's the axis that you see here. So part of it is about, well, how do we deal with the heritage? Because the factories have been built over centuries, so they're valuable. Do they need to be maintained, become a museum or some kind of protected building? Or do we accept that it's part of an industrial landscape, that it has always been productive and developed? And does that development keep going? And how do we deal with energy? So energy abundant in the past. Now, because of geopolitics, it either disappears entirely, it becomes unaffordable, or we find alternative sources, a geothermal source, for instance, and energy is, again, not a problem. And within this matrix, we created 4 scenarios. One would be to be more kind of lower the volumes of production, but go to more value added. production, so artistic papers, but also focus more on workshops for artists and tourists instead of focusing on production. It's a different economy. Or like one of the factories is already doing, do you focus on high-tech papers, so transfer papers that are not the bulk of the production, but require a lot more skilled laborers and production processes and have a much smaller footprint, much smaller emissions, less space use. Do we keep going, but in a new location? So do we abandon the current sites and then find other places in town to kind of rebuild this industry to modern standards? Which has been done in the past as well, because these factories kept kind of growing and jumping forward. Or are we looking for a more circular scenario where all of the different flows of materials and energy are connected? And that's also something that you see now in the factories, but also in the past. So the 3 factories together send their wastewater to a wastewater management facility that takes out the fibers that are then sold for other processes. They produce biogas that is used in one of the factories to heat the process, and the water goes back to the factories as well. They even heat one of the swimming pools with a heat exchange from the factory. So there is already kind of this integrated system, which of course, if we want to be circular in the Netherlands in 2050, which our government says we will be, we need to look for all these connections of processes. Then we also kind of indicated sites that were then most relevant, right? So these are kind of the long-term perspectives to discuss. And then we said, well, okay, if this kind of the craft scenario would come into effect, then you use the old factories, but mainly the oldest parts of the old factories, and they have to be, you need investment there to turn them into something else. But basically you would use the same sites. If you focus on a high-tech scenario, there's other people coming in. As I said, smaller footprint, different technology. The locations that are more in the forest are much more preferential because it's higher quality of living. That also means that the current spaces, the current size of the factories become available for something else. So there's always kind of the long-term perspective with an action that you then would take in the coming years. For the circular scenario, kind of vicinity or closeness of flows and processes is important. So then you'd see kind of that the old stream, the old river becomes the backbone of all these new connections, and possibly also using the excess heat, not just to heat swimming pools, but also heat houses, for instance, and other processes. And the restart scenario would move the paper industry out of town to a location that is along a canal, along a highway, so it's much better situated for the infrastructures. So the big trucks don't have to go through the village anymore, and kind of solve the problem there. Now, a difficulty with the self-initiated project is always that, well, you need funding. So we got a grant from the RCA, the government agency for heritage, because we did the research into this historic energy landscape. We found one of the aldermen of the municipality. He was very interested. Later we figured out that he was, before he became the alderman, one of the not the mayor, but kind of higher ups in the city. He used to make TV shows. So he was kind of a creative thinker, and he liked our ideas of what we were doing. We were supported by the ERBL as well to be part of this public debate. Just before COVID, we found funding to make the scenarios also debatable, to have a public dialogue. And what we designed was kind of a hot tub next to a factory in the forest, with the idea that everyone would just come in and have a conversation with the alderman to talk about these futures. So unfortunately, this did not happen. It's maybe still there in the future, but also as a way that creating these scenarios is also a way of avoiding coming with one solution, right? I don't have the answer, I'm not the prophet, but we see these different scenarios developing, and we'd like the input from the residents, from the owners of the factories, of the politicians, together to discuss them and maybe come up with a 5th scenario, or take elements of the 4 that we developed and then decide what would work best for them. So that's kind of the qualitative approach. It's really about telling the story of the history of Eerbeek and then projecting that forward. The second project has a much more data-driven approach, which we did for the province of Zuid-Holland. And province is one of the oblast, I guess. So there's 12 of them in the Netherlands. Zuid-Holland is this area where here is Rotterdam. This is The Hague, so kind of a crop of the Netherlands. And what the province did in the past years was to digitalize and georeference all the data that they had on land use. So what you see on the map here is the residential areas, greenhouses, industry, agricultural land, and how that developed over the past 5 decades. And they asked us to both analyze these transformations, but also see if we could use them as a projection into the next 50 years. So this is kind of the method, which is a bit of the statistic approach. So what we did, we kind of used all the data and put them in 500 by 500 meter grids and added other data that we had available. So data on where are the highways, when were they built, what is the public transport network, when were stations added, what do we know about the soil conditions and kind of the level above or below sea level. And then run it in a R software, which is kind of a statistic software, to look for correlations. So is one development linked to another one? Not necessarily causation, but is a development for business district as a transformation to residential, or a development from agricultural land to green space, or any of the transformations that are possible, are they related? Now it's moving a lot. Is it related to any of the other criteria? So is it related to another transformation? Is it related to soil type? So peat, clay, water, sand. Is it related to how it's above or beyond sea level? And also, how does it relate to policies that we had in the Netherlands? So groeikern is new town development, which dates back to the 60s, 70s, where certain areas of the province were designated to generate most of the housing. Groene Hart and the buffer are more protective to prevent Rotterdam and The Hague growing together with this sprawl development. There's designated green areas in between. And how do they affect these changes? And what the circles mean is kind of a white circle means a positive relation. In black, it's a negative correlation. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the likelihood that one transformation is linked to another condition. So for instance, what you see is that height above sea level is quite a big negative correlation. Basically, that means that in the past 50 years, we started to build lower and lower. So we're a country below sea level, and we're developing the lowest part of our country. Positive aspects are, for instance, vicinity of public transport. So investments in public transport help in driving transformation to residential areas. There's also bouwjaar, which is the building age. So a new development will trigger another new development. It's kind of the business as usual, but if something changes, then it's quite likely that the area next to it will also change. More technical stuff. What we then did is look for parameters that we could use, not just for the past, but also for the coming 50 years. So what will be the parameters that would drive transformations in the next 50 years? And what we try to do here again is 5 scenarios. One is the business as usual. So we just took the largest relations from the past and continued them for the next 50 years, which doesn't fit in the Netherlands, because then the areas that show up are either already built or in other use. And it's difficult to read here, but the 4 other scenarios are the 5-minute city. So what are areas that have great facilities already, but low density? How can they be developed? One is called hoog en droog, which means high and dry, which makes sense in the Netherlands. So what are the areas that maybe are safe to develop? So how is it related to sea level and soil conditions? And the third one was accessibility. So not just facilities, but also how is it related to infrastructure. and a living landscape. So what are locations maybe for new types of living, where agricultural land gets transformed into housing, but also production land, maybe comparable to some of the examples that Saskia showed. Again, using our software, the statistics and QGIS, the geo information systems, what we try to do is look for the same patterns and then see the likelihood of a transformation within these scenarios. So this is, for instance, locations that make sense from a water management point of view, and then the blue are actually positive. The red ones are negative relation because they're even lower in the conditions, or lower in relation to sea level. Vicinity or accessibility, what you see here is in blue is the areas that have kind of a high percentage or a high amount of facilities, shops, doctors, these kind of things, but relatively low density of houses. So then the blue ones show up. And for each of these 4 scenarios, we had the locations that would be most preferential and try to sketch out this landscape that would then come up. So this is the living landscape type of landscape, which are now agricultural areas that are not that far away from city centers and have potential to transform into new types of residential areas, because we know that because of the conditions, it's not likely that it's going to be agricultural land in the future. This was not a storytelling project for residents. This was really for the government of the province to use in their dialogue with the different municipalities in South Holland. So they used the scenarios to discuss development plans of the individual municipalities to see if they make sense in these scenarios. So to round up, there was some statistics. I'm not a mathematician, I don't like numbers, but I think it helps in understanding kind of how you can use these scenarios. And I really like base theory. It's not that complicated, but this looks very complicated. Basically what it says is, what is the likelihood of something happening after another event? So the probability of something happening after something else happening is basically the inverse times the amount, the likelihood that something will happen divided by the likelihood of the other event. Still sounds quite complicated, but if you have no information about whether something can happen or not, you have to assume that it's 50-50, right? It can happen or not. If it's a continual opportunity or probability, you get the standard deviation, right? Most likely it's going to be here, it could be here, and it could be there. What happens if you gain new insights, new information? That means that you can change one of the p's, the probabilities. So it turns out that the likelihood of something happening is affected by an event that you can observe. Right? So you're working in scenarios, you observe an action, something happens, and you can fine-tune the probability of one of the scenarios and the actions that you were working on before. Now, to round it off, because I know that's kind of what's going on there, I like these diagrams by Take de Jong, and Take de Jong was a professor at TU Delft developing methodologies. And what he says, the field of design is interesting because it's kind of looking for everything that is possible, compare it to what forecast or what futurists are doing, because what we design is everything that is possible. And futurologists are thinking of what is likely that's happening, and everything that is likely exists in the realm of everything that is possible, right? We can think of much more than what is likely that can happen. And then there's the aspect of politics, which is what we dream about, right? This is everything that we might want. So for instance, we can design a house, and it's probably going to be built. We can also design a city on Mars. It's possible. It's not very likely, but it could exist. And what our work as designers in this whole futuring scenario developing is basically coming up with scenarios, strategies to go from an existing situation that exists, but is not desirable, right? It's outside the field of what is wanted. And we need to move it to something that we can imagine is at the current moment not likely that it will happen, but it's very desirable. And we do that by designing, by prototyping, by coming up with images of this future that trigger people to think of, yes, I want to join you, I want to go there as well, I want to discuss it. And that's what I want to give you today. What I hope you will also see in the exhibition of Panorama Ukraine, because we need these images of long-term thinking to kind of get away from the current issues, the current pains, and think of where do we want to go together. So, thank you, and I hope there's many questions.
If you're talking about some trends or, I don't know, initiation, like if we looking back to some traditional way of producing and consuming energy, in terms of idea of decentralization, or let's call it energy communities. What is like most like interesting I don't know, approaches which combine like design, energy science, and like producing, exchanging, accumulating, somehow like how conceptually could be framed this like a way of thinking, and how we could, I don't know, some kind of relate different, I don't know, stakeholders, families, technologies, what is like
I can reflect on it.
Yeah.
I think it's a very important question, and I can reflect from it from a Dutch situation where I see a lot of emphasis on individual solutions. Right? We subsidize solar panels, we subsidize heat pumps for the individual, and we work on the centralized system still. So we're transforming the centralized system to something that goes into the future, but it's still centralized, and the two don't meet. And what I've seen in the workshop in the Panorama Ukraine is that in between are the neighborhoods where both neighbors meet, where energy can be exchanged, where affordability and fairness of energy availability can be discussed. But it's also the scale where you can still see the energy that's produced, how it's stored, how it's used, and then the centralized system is only a backup. So what I hope we can do in collaborating with energy experts is think of this scale in between, which does not exist in the world of the energy experts. Of course, as urban designers and architects, we are quite familiar with it. So can we use our methods of working in a neighborhood, on a street level, in a building block, and add energy to that mix? And what is then the technique, or what is the discussion that we have that creates also spatial quality next to social and financial equality?
Yeah, I would say that besides that question, I think that we are also faced with questioning or having a bit of awareness on how much we consume. So that there's also maybe a sort of behavioral pattern that needs to shift a little bit, besides the larger systemic question and how we integrate all of this. There it becomes a bit more difficult, I would say. But it is a conversation that I, for instance, see in Belgium. They're doing very nice experiments with parts of the house that is heated, others are not. And so it is a chessboard on which we have to play chess on multiple levels, multiple skills. But indeed, if we bring all of that together, I'm very inspired also by the decentralized ownership model of solar panels. So you take what you need, you give back to the system, and as Gerjan mentioned, that then let's say the energy providers, they are the backbone, but their model is more about providing shortages or surplus.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing to keep in mind in this shift to a sustainable system is that the production of wind turbines and solar panels is intermittent, right? We're still used, at least in the Netherlands, as energy being always available Of course, that can rapidly change, as you have experienced. But in a fully sustainable system, we have an abundance of energy in the summer and probably a shortage of energy in winter. So how are we going to deal with the availability of energy? One way would be to be more aware of it and also design ways and live ways that our behavior becomes seasonal again. And the other thing is, how do we store the energy, which is a technical question.
Yeah.
For example, it's like storage, water as energy storage.
Yes.
You know, kind of. And do you have some like example of the project which also landscape like a main tool for, I don't know, storaging or for using, I don't know, in maybe old, maybe new way of energy?
Yeah. I think there's beautiful historic examples, like the pond in Eerbeek that was used to store water, which of course is modernized in hydro plants or storage of hydro energy. Newer techniques also store heat in water in big tanks. Can be done, but it requires quite a lot of concrete to build those structures, and they're quite space consuming. Here, but also in the Netherlands, we see a lot of attention for lithium batteries, which are very expensive, very heavy on material use, but they're available now. So I'm not sure how much we should kind of subsidize or hope that they will contribute. But there's also other techniques that use, for instance, salt or basalt as a kind of a heavy material that can be heated up, that can be either transported or more easily integrated in our housing environment. And of course, there's biomass. So on the long term, we can store energy and CO2 in production of wood, of other fibers, which also has its downside because it needs to be burned again.
Anyone else? We gave you too much information. You're all.
Yeah.
Thank you for your incredible presentations. Third time this year we organized Week for Belfort in the city, and the current topic will be building continuities. I think this is like also a thread crossing your both presentations, and I'm just wondering what does this mean? This means for topic that you presented. I mean, as architects want to knock, for instance, as you Saskia presented in your presentation, they constantly use this classical elements that you can find in Netherlands architecture, but also using them without maybe some meaning, let's say, that was in a classical Netherlands architecture. So the topic of continuity, but also your presentation, the continuity of, let's say, alternative continuities that could be found in different scenarios that you elaborated for this paper factory and the development of the small town.
Yeah. Very interesting question. It was at the core of the It's About Time exhibition to look at which kind of continuities and temporalities can we flag, and my gosh, where to start? I would dare say that we are starting to think about our practice as a temporal value, either through, you mentioned ornamentation, that is maybe hollow, but if we look at it from a financial gaze, for instance, one of the things that I see very currently activated is to look at what your property value is after 30 years. So usually it's out of the books then, but what is it still representing as an asset? It's very technical, very financial, but this is something that we are looking at now, because you see with the 2050, so the Paris Proof, there's a whole new regulation, there's a whole new narrative on what your building should be. So if your asset, your architecture, is still interesting for investors in 2050, you can pull that finance towards the contemporary and make a better building. So that's maybe pulling the future back to the present. we see a lot of, I would nearly say, a sort of modesty and a humble architecture in the Netherlands, where we really look back at inspiring techniques, material, this idea of there is no waste. I would say maybe at the turn of the century, people were constantly looking at things that we could somehow reuse again. So the whole idea of that we live in a surplus society with this endless growth, I think we have to embrace that this is a dead end. And not in a sort of moralist way, but it is just maybe situating ourselves again in a larger pattern, in a larger system of a cyclical understanding of life. It sounds a bit baroque maybe, but that is truly how I believe we should reconfigure on a smart way. And personally, you know, that for instance, if an ornament is used in a neoclassical manner, you know, I can turn a blind eye. There is this constant question of, like, did modernity fail? We even have a very active group in the Netherlands called Field Architecture that looks at modernity as this ambition to elevate all of us. Yeah. If you do a lot of people just like something they recognize. So that's another way of temporality. Like, how do you somehow not become too nostalgic, but look for progressive ways forward? I think it's a marvelous topic that we can talk about for a long, long time. But I'll let Gert-Jan maybe speak a bit more about the technical.
No, I'm very happy with this discussion, because it is true that it's very important at this moment. And of course, as architects, we come from the culture of the new, right? Especially since modernists, we are agents of change. We come with our new ideas, disruptions. And we now see that the populist parties are using that against us, right? We are the new, we are change, we are scary, because change is scary. And then the nostalgia that comes in, that gives comfort, right? We know it and everything is still safe. In architecture, that plays a role, in urban development, but especially in the energy transition, because every component, every technology that we have in our advantage is new. Right? There's a steel or aluminum wind turbine. There's a solar panel that, I don't know, comes from China, from wherever. So there's a huge opposition against these development because it's new. And it's in places where people don't understand what it's doing. It's in agricultural land. It's in their horizon. By using stories of the past, both about energy, but also about how any city grows, it becomes possible to kind of speak to people, to things that they recognize, right? They understand that they are part of a productive landscape, that they're part of a location that has always been changing. And it's much easier to talk to non-professionals coming from the background of something that they recognize, of the stories that they are familiar with, and then bring it into the future, because they do see that there is urgency, that there is issues that need to be resolved. But it's very difficult to then come with a techno fix, but it's much easier to continue stories that they kind of recognize and that can kind of keep on going. Yeah.
And maybe two things while I was listening that came to mind is that, for instance, large societal influences now, I find it interesting that the whole question of the digital is, we use the digital sphere or data very marginally. And I think there is an opportunity there for architecture and urban thinkers to use it as a tool to get better arguments to a certain extent. So that's what I aimed to show in my presentation, that we see that from a classical understanding of our profession, this kind of system thinking and analyzing and visualizing, mind you, can have a very important tool to think through different models of living together, because as I aimed to get across, I think this way is now just a race to the bottom. We see a very large division between the haves and the have-not. We see that if we do not talk about ownership, and now ownership is of course at the 1%, and then through inheritance, it's the Piketty model, you'll become rich because your parents were rich, but we are in a decline of welfare to a certain extent. So how do you embrace these very large topics that are seeds for discomfort and make that into positive conversations about potentiality? I think that's still where our discipline has a role to play, but maybe less without the oracle or without the... there's more porosity, there's more respect. And I know that my students always say Holland is no longer tolerant. It's very interesting. So we have this, why am I mentioning this? That I truly believe that we also need to be clear about what will not happen. So if you express a desire as a user, and it can't be done, that you have to be clear and say this and this and this is why not, because in the projection of the desire is already the discomfort of not getting what you want. But if we start to embrace the fact that we can still have beautiful lives, but maybe just with different rhythms and different kinds of continuity, I don't know, it's half an answer, but I just wanted to bring in this ownership and the digital as not... I know that a lot of people are fearful of AI, but it's also a great way to think through what does it mean to, what is knowledge and how is it a tool, and how does humankind, it's as old as the correlation man-machine, but now it becomes really questioning, of course, our own existence to a certain extent. But I truly believe that there's opportunities for us to start designing with, it is a material, but I would say maybe something we cannot grasp, so the larger systems. Very long answer again, I'm sorry. I try to be more to the point. But anyone? Don't feel obliged. We can, yes please.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning data, because it's really, we don't have as much as you, and we use even less as you, and it's also, in my opinion, it's big resource for making things better when we could understand what happened and why it happened and how it can correlate with other things. But shorter question about this town with paper mills. In your different strategies you showed, how you accounted for kind of man-made ecosystem, because you mentioned that there is waste treatment which produce something for community, there is pool which use something from factory, and if we decrease factory 10 times in production, then makes sense that it will be less resource for this treatment, factory less fuel, less heating for local systems, and so on and so on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, thank you. Yes, it's something that we are definitely aware of, but we did not try to fix it or to solve it, right? So in some of the scenarios, it would mean that the treatment facility does not work anymore, or that not all of the paper factories exist anymore. What we try to do is kind of show these long-term developments and then open the discussion for residents. And well, if you want this, if this is kind of your desired future, it means that in that future, the treatment facility does not exist anymore, or it means that the ecosystem that we have now does not exist anymore. So yes, it is very important, but we did not try to solve it.
Yeah. But that refers again to what I was trying to get across. I think if you give people a sort of clarity in the options, that is, well, to my understanding, really a very powerful vehicle, because everybody, reads the newspaper and is concerned about the future of their children and so on and so forth. So, yeah. Now I'm going to have to think about this idea of longevity for the next week. Yeah, what would it mean for your context? Just also to ask something back.
Well, I mean, you mentioned some of the important topics of that, because we have also disruption in the knowledge generations, you know, and there was a Soviet school of architecture and so on, then some disruption in the 90s, then now learning from the West and not forgetting like what was done in the Soviet time somehow. So it's always these disruptions here in Ukraine, and you know, with first two forums we taken the topics of defining values and taking responsibilities, so it was very general and not so much professional, I would say, like strictly professional. But with this one, I think it's important to we aim to think about these continuities, both in embracing, of course, somehow traditions, not in a stylish form, but in using materials, local materials, but also using like appropriate techniques for solving the problems that are there, and also thinking continuities of architectural knowledge and instruments, and how the generation, let's say, make it, let's say, make the single, let's say, make the bigger infrastructural or transformations of the environment possible.
Yeah.
It's not done in one generation, but in longer period. That's why I think your presentations are incredibly interesting for that topic. So
thank you. Super. I'm also reminded by your remark of Oleg and I think it was already 10 years ago, we're in a panel in Odessa, and two things I want to say about that. It occurred to me that many of the questions that you are dealing with, or the potential to make a sort of jump, is that I don't want to be rude, but that you can nearly sort of jump from some questions that are stuck in the 20th century and can jump into the 21st century in a certain way. But your project that you showed, which was about the problematic of the ringway separating Odessa from the sea. It was a lecture of an hour, so I'm being very disrespectful, but the idea of the barrier and mobility as the driver of everything. And what we notice now, for instance, we are collaborating with there's a science called transition science that looks at this projection into the future and then does backcasting. So if you want to end there, what do you need to do now? But also looks back. And this particular gentleman is Dirk Loorbach from the Erasmus University, looks at e-mobility, but then shared e-mobility. So 90% of our cars is actually just doing one movement from house to the work with one person. So what if you would share the mobility? The mobility would of course be automated. We actually can already, each Tesla can already, sorry, it wasn't, no pun intended, can already fully be automated. But if we would share our mobility, we only need 30% of all cars. That means that 70% of all our roads, of all our parking spots, can become something else. What? So that's a technological question. But of course, in the 50s and 60s, at least in the Dutch context or the Western, it was all about mobility. Everything was, put in different spots. We could connect it with roads, and even our movies, The Easy Rider, this whole projection of ownership and freedom and masculinity, and is part of this resistance towards maybe a much better model where we can have greener spaces, more sports, reflect on the 5 to 15 minute city, question this barrier between cities, and in this case in Odessa, of course, the port city. These are of very, very large societal questions. And yeah, I think to me this is very challenging to think about what happens if we organize something that is just around the corner differently.
If I may make it to talk about, can continuity. To me, it's like we have like a several breakpoints and very like a dramatic and crucial. And maybe this it's also like quite like an important point of arriving for all of us to reconstructed relationship between a society and architects or designers of different kinds, and also like a second action have to be find like a new cooperation with the local industries, because only local industries could introduce relationship between environment and like a social, physical, geology environment and like a architecture or like a built environment, like this bridging from some. Because it's many things are untranslatable. I mean, even technology, because we have like a different condition, and somehow we could to relate all these approaches.
Well, if I speak from my own, so I'm a product of the 90s, and the market was the devil. And what we see now is that we are seeing extremely inspiring collaboration, either with different knowledge systems or different financial models, or so this idea of togetherness, and we are still searching on how to do that. Actually,
we see how this strong Dutch identity based on natural condition and all challenges, which like providing this particular environment for this particular society, and I don't know, also including some kind of historical mental patterns. I don't know, like Calvinism, or I don't know, even
But also the Dutch society has changed. In the last 15 to 20 years, things have really radically become, well, due to a very particular kind of politics. I personally feel that we have really, to a certain extent, lost our capacity to it's no longer a social democracy, let's put it this way. We've it's like a splinter society. I mean, I'm maybe being too dramatic. You have a different view maybe, but this idea of that we're innovative, and actually tolerance comes with saying we cannot do this. Tolerance is, this is my border. You're stepping over my border. We need to have a conversation. Tolerance is not like let everything come. No, it is about having a vision, a plan, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and I agree that we need to look for these new relations, because many entrepreneurs have incredibly great ideas about how to organize things differently. Yeah. I wanted to end up on a high note, but not doing a good job.
To architecture, that relationship that you have described from politics or societal sphere, right? They also have mirroring in the special terms, right? Because there is this book, Architecture of Public Space, maybe you saw it from Italian Labix. So it's beautiful examples of how the single public space in one of the Italian cities is built in 6 centuries.
Yeah.
But with the same idea, that architecture is a frame, and it's actually fulfilling some kind of program that was set up in 12th century, but then in 18th century, the last part was built. It's incredible continuity of it was just the idea that like Colin Rowe mentioned in his book, like architecture is just space defined, not occupied. And with these disruptions of occupants in the city and the disruptive spaces, we have cities that are not fulfilling the function that was meant to be there, but with the idea of continuity and maybe of the architecture as also space definers and making the spaces possible. It's like defining where there should be this frame or this border that you mentioned, right? Not having the tolerance overwhelming, but setting barriers and setting some frames for things to happen.
I think in your presentation at the end there were some beautiful examples of kind of the cooperative developments, both of the Rotterdam High Line and the Warre, the housing project. And in the past year there's been a tendency, also supported by politics, to kind of make a barrier out of your boundary, right? So instead of the gamma-schutting, like every garden ends in a wall, these projects kind of try to open up this space in a very literal way. But it's also about building trust, because it's not simply one action, this is my boundary and I need to push back. No, it's a continuous shape, and it's not just the two, there's more involved. And there is a few more and more examples what that can mean spatially. And those examples kind of function in the in-between, the highly privatized space and the collective space, which we don't trust anymore. But it builds space and architecture of conversation, of building trust. And I think that happens both in the Netherlands and here, because I think also after the collapse of the Soviet Union, most countries went to a highly individualized society with very little trust. I've heard stories about the ÖBB, the housing collectives here, that are very difficult to work with. So we need these inspiring examples of how beautiful and how nice these places of collectiveness can be. Because I do believe that probably 90% of the people actually want to be part of it if they see the success of it. There's still 10% that want to be kind of outside off-grid somewhere. That's fine. But now kind of the 10% that have a desire for that individual future is kind of, it's the majority of what we produce, of how we think of space.
I'm aware of the time, but feel free if you still have a question. Can be something completely different, modest or large. You sure? All is clear? Will you start tomorrow? Shall we keep it at that then?
Good.
Okay, thank you for having us. And in case you haven't seen the exhibition on the second spot of the Lviv Mobility Center, then please join. It's a small exhibition, which is just the beginning, hopefully, as said, of a longer conversation. Have a lovely Sunday. Doei.